In case you missed it, we're well and truly in pre-budget season. On Tuesday, the Treasurer will hand down his third budget, and the government's already started making some announcements and hinting at those that are to come next week. The immediate difficulty for the Treasurer is inflation, which is proving to be stickier than certainly he would like. And this week, the Reserve Bank has also been warning that interest rates might still have to rise again. The longer-term challenge for the Treasurer, though, is reshaping the economy as it transitions to a net zero future, reshaping the budget to put it on a more sustainable footing as spending pressures continue to rise. And many would also like to see him reshape the tax system, particularly to help those younger workers punished by high income tax rates while also being locked out of the housing market. So in the lead up to this budget, who better to talk to about what can and should be done about both these short and longer term challenges than Ken Henry, who led Treasury for a decade and also oversaw the last serious review of the tax system. Ken Henry, welcome. Really good to talk to you.
Good to be with you, David.
So, look, before we get into some of those longer-term challenges, and also keen for your thoughts on the government's future Made in Australia plans that it's been talking a lot about, this immediate issue of inflation, what do you think? Should the budget be used to put downward pressure on inflation?
No, it is a good question, and it's understandable why people would ask the question. After all, the budget is not in good shape structurally. We know that. It hasn't improved in a structural sense since we came out of the global financial crisis. So there is a problem there on the budget. And in addition, of course, we've just over the last little while had 13 interest rate increases on the trot from the Reserve Bank. And so it's natural to ask the question whether a tighter fiscal stance might not help the Reserve Bank in its job of trying to control inflation. But against that, it seems to me that we need to wait and see what the full impact of those 13 interest rate increases from the Reserve Bank are. And there are signs that the economy might be on something of a knife edge, actually. It's not, everywhere you look, an incredibly buoyant economy. Indeed, if you look at the labour market, and a lot of people have been looking at the labour market, there's been a lot of talk about how tight the labour market is. Whereas vacancies, job vacancies, were very high, until recently they've come off quite a lot. And although the unemployment rate is still sub 4, and most people would think that the natural rate of unemployment, or rather what the Reserve Bank calls the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, is somewhat above 4. So it kind of suggests that maybe the labour market is currently a bit tighter than the Reserve Bank would be comfortable with. Against that, have a look at what's happened to hours worked in the Australian economy. I mean, it's actually quite extraordinary that despite strong population growth that we've had, despite the fact that the workforce participation rate stands at an all-time high, and despite the fact, therefore, an historic proportion of the Australian population is in a job, total hours worked in the Australian economy are lower now than they were 12 months ago. This economy has been softening.
Yeah, and if it is on that knife edge, as you say, and looking deeper at some of those figures certainly underscores that, you don't think the budget, therefore, should be used to try and drive down inflation? You're worried that that could do too much damage?
Yeah. We have to be careful in our use of fiscal policy to try to achieve an inflation target. That was a lesson that we learned a long time ago. In fact, many people would have said that we came out of the 1970s understanding that lesson, but certainly by the time that we came out of the recession of the early 1990s, the consensus, a very broadly based consensus among economists, was that monetary policy was the better tool to use to try to control inflation. That doesn't mean fiscal policy is off the hook. What it does mean is that you don't want fiscal policy working against monetary policy.
Yeah. So what it needs to be neutral? Yeah. Is that the best way of describing it?
I think right now a neutral stance is the appropriate stance. Yeah, neither adding to demand nor substantially detracting from demand.
See, that's interesting. And you're one of the few people in this country, I suppose, who's been Treasury Secretary. You therefore sit on the Reserve Bank board.
Sure.
How does the Reserve Bank look at budgets, do they expect help to tackle inflation or what's the view?
Well, you wouldn't be surprised to hear this. What they really worry about is nasty surprises, right?
Right.
That's what they worry about. They like to think that fiscal policy is not going to deliver a nasty surprise for them, something to make their job more difficult.
And there's no sign that's going to happen.
There's no sign of that. I don't expect that, no.
Yeah, and so look, when it comes to interest rates then, what do you think? Do you reckon we'll have to get another one? Or do you think, given we're on a knife edge, as you say, we'll probably just stay where we are for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, look, it's, it's a mug's game, really, to try to forecast this stuff. But I can understand, let me put it this way, I can understand why the Reserve Bank Board decided to pause yesterday, right? Because we are on this knife edge. And I guess the factors that they're weighing up, and like if I was on the Reserve Bank Board right now, what would give me cause for concern is that we have recently seen increases, quite substantial increases actually, in inflationary pressure from domestic sources. So look at services, which are obviously produced in Australia rather than offshore. And there's signs that the cost of services have been increasing in Australia. That would worry the Reserve Bank. And the other thing that worries them, I suspect, is that until recently, the costs of goods and services that we import from overseas, those things were taking a bit of pressure out of the Australian system because prices there were falling a bit, or at least the inflationary pressure was coming out. And it does look like there's been a bit of a turnaround globally. So inflation has picked up globally. And the Reserve Bank would be, I think they might have been a little blindsided by that. No criticism, would have blindsided anybody, I think. And so now they're wondering, I mean, they were probably thinking that their next move would be down, and now they'd be wondering, maybe we have to hold this for a while longer.
Yeah, well, it looks that way. And just one more on budget, because I often get confused about this. We hear the government say they can provide cost of living relief that puts downward pressure on inflation. They did the energy bill relief last time. Looks like they'll do it again this time. Does that put downward pressure on inflation, really?
It's a really good question, right? So it is possible for a government to change prices of goods and services in the economy by the use of taxes and or subsidies, right? So it's possible to do that. But when you're consider, like if it was the Reserve Bank considering whether in net terms the budget puts upward pressure or downward pressure on prices, on inflation, what they would be looking at is the overall stance of the budget. So what they would be looking at is the budget deficit or getting smaller, or is the budget surplus getting larger? And if neither of those two things are happening, then it's difficult to argue that fiscal policy, taken as a whole, is putting downward pressure on prices.
Right. So let's come to that bottom line. It looks like we'll get a surplus, but then we go back into deficits and those pressures continue to build.
Yeah.
Look, the government, I want to get to this reform question because the government's been in office 2 years now. They've done things like, to be fair, rejigged tax cuts, increased tax on big super accounts. They've made some changes on competition policy, foreign investment rules, the way the Reserve Bank works, and they're trying to get a vehicle emissions standard introduced. But would you describe this as a reformist government or an incrementalist government?
Very much incrementalist, very much. But then that doesn't really distinguish it from several governments that preceded it, right? Put it this way, I would say that taking the Australian Parliament as a whole, it has not proved capable of delivering sustained or a sustainable reform package for 25 years now. That isn't to say that we haven't had big things done. We've had big things done and we've had big things undone. The classic, of course, is the emissions trading scheme or the carbon price, right, or the carbon tax. I mean, that was... I find it still, David, I find it still difficult to believe that it happened because... obviously I was following the politics at the time, but I thought, God, nobody can be that mad, really. Seriously. No, honestly, because it was widely seen, and everywhere in the world as world's best policy for tackling climate change. It was just absolutely outstanding. And it had a demonstrably positive impact on bringing Australia's emissions down over the 2 year period.
So why did you think that was mad?
It was mad to get rid of it.
Oh, right, to get rid of it. I thought you were saying it was mad to attempt such a bold political move.
No. Well, no. And I'm not making a political judgment here. I mean, I understand the difficulty of sustaining reform through our incredibly adversarial political system.
That's what I wanted to ask you about. I mean, you, as I understand it, you left academia to join Paul Keating's office as Treasurer because he was such a bold reformist.
Yeah, that's correct.
Are we in a different time now with the fracturing of, major parties and I guess the political landscape and the media and all of that? Is it harder now, do you think? We often hear this, that it's harder these days than it was back then. Well, what do you think?
It probably is harder, but we don't really know because I don't think anybody's trying as hard as people tried back then. I mean, I just don't think they are. The case for reform was constructed. It's not as if everybody in Australia woke up one morning and thought, oh my God, we need to reform this place. The case for reform had been constructed over a very long period of time. And of course, it was probably, at least the big reforms or the harder reforms were probably made possible because of Paul Keating's construction of his particular burning platform with his Banana Republic speech. It wasn't really a speech, it was just a response to a question on Talkback Radio, but nevertheless. And that probably provided the circumstances in that you had the Treasurer of the country saying, you know what, we're in a crisis. And so all bets are off and we have to do whatever we can to get ourselves out of this crisis.
It's about telling that story, isn't it? Telling
that story. It's about constructing the narrative in a way that resonates with people and in a way that's, well-based in economics. So it has to be a highly credible story for multiple audiences, but it has to be told in a way that resonates with the population, and that also puts the opposition on notice in a way, right? That, you can attack this if you like, but you will be seen to be obstructionist and you will be seen to be not acting in the national interest.
So what's the
right
story?
Now we lack it.
What's the story we need to be told now, do you think? When you look at what needs to happen?
Yeah, so I thought we embarked on the development of this narrative, this reform narrative, with the release of the first intergenerational report 22 years ago. I mean, I honestly did. I thought this is going to set the scene for the development of a compelling narrative that allows politicians to explain to people why Australia needs to do more, that what we've done to date is not, it's dealt well. If you think back in 2002, we were going pretty well. We had a big budget surplus, right? And we had demonstrated that we were very good at dealing with several events. The Asian financial crisis of 1997-98 didn't cause us a problem. 2001, the whole industrialised world, or at least taken as a block, fell into recession. We avoided that recession. It didn't cause a hiccup in Australia. And a large part of the reason for that is because we were deriving strong benefits through increases in workforce participation, but more importantly through productivity growth, strong productivity growth that charged the Australian economy right through the second half of the 1990s into the early part of the 2000s. So everything looked pretty good, but then we were casting our minds forward to the challenges that were going to be confronting Australia.
Ageing population and
resources particularly. Well, we didn't even have the resources boom then, David. The resources boom occurred, it really took off in December 2003. We were not anticipating the resources boom, right? Actually, that turned out to be a real problem for the construction of the narrative.
It delayed the case for action, I suppose.
Well, and I feel... I don't feel at all comfortable about that because actually it should have accelerated the case for action. Like the resources boom. I mean, the myth that Australians appear to accept, and most of Australia's leading politicians obviously accept it, the myth is that there's some magical trickle-down effect going on here, that if Australian exporters of iron ore and coal and gas see their world prices quadrupling, which is what has happened, quadrupling, if they see the prices quadrupling, that somehow those higher prices of iron ore and coal and gas are going to feed through to improve living standards for Australians generally, when only 2% of the Australian workforce works in the mining sector. Now, you know...
Don't we get more budget revenues, though? More.
Yeah, we do. Okay, so we do get more budget revenues from company tax. And, of course, the resource-rich states, they get increased royalty revenues, right? But then you also lose revenue from the activities that are squeezed out or crowded out of the economy. If you go back to the early 1990s that I was referring to earlier, you know, when by the early 1990s as we came out of recession, I thought, well, you know, we've learned as much economics as we need to learn in this country. Turns out not to be true. But if you go back then, manufacturing made up 15% of the Australian economy. Not employment, but 15% of GDP, gross domestic product, came from manufacturing and 5% from mining. Today, those numbers are reversed, right? So today, manufacturing makes up 5%. And mining makes up 15%. In dollar terms, what we're talking about in dollars of today is the difference between $130 billion a year and $400 billion a year.
Wow.
This is no small
So resources
thing.
crowded out manufacturing.
Yeah, correct. And look, you know, the textbooks that I studied, actually, you know, because I was keen on economics, I was still a teenager when I learned that that's one of the impacts of a terms of trade improvement in Australia. It's not as if this is economics that you need to have a PhD to understand, even though I would say most people who call themselves economists appear not to understand it.
Well, that brings you, because I'm very keen for your thoughts on what the government's talking about with its Future Made in Australia plan. It wants to bring back, yes, some manufacturing, but really targeted at the things that are going to help us get to net zero. So, you know, subsidising and incentivising solar panel manufacturing, maybe battery manufacturing, processing critical minerals. Is this a good idea?
Honestly, I don't know. So, and the reason I don't know is I don't really know what is involved. I don't know quite why it's being done, and I don't understand the scale of the ambition that sits behind it. I mean, obviously, though, if our leaders want to take us back to the structure of the economy that we had in the early 90s, then they got to, I don't know why they would, but if they did, they got to find a way of boosting the manufacturing sector from 5% of GDP to 15% of GDP, which, as I said, is the difference between 130 billion and 400 billion. This is not small stuff. This is huge stuff. And we know why manufacturing declined from 15% to 5%. It was partly due to tariff reforms, of course, to reducing protection in the Australian economy. But that task had pretty much been accomplished by the turn of the century. The bigger driver of it is actually the mining boom. That's, you know, like at the turn of the century, mining was still sitting at that 5% that it had been at when we came out of the early 90s recession. It was really post-December 2003 when mining really took off and demonstrably crowded out manufacturing and a good deal of other parts of the economy as well. And so what I don't know is how ambitious this Made in Australia policy is. Look, the government's not going to listen to this, but I'm going to say it anyway, right?
They might.
Yeah, no, they won't. No, they won't listen to it. I know why they won't. But look, seriously, if you wanted to increase manufacturing in Australia in a big way, you would put a big tax on the mining sector. That's what you do.
Interesting.
Yeah, well, you would. And you have to in order to free up the resources to go to the manufacturing sector.
So you need to squeeze mining to make manufacturing viable.
Indeed you do. Indeed you do. And unless and until our leaders understand that lesson and act on that lesson, whatever they do on manufacturing, look, it might be helpful. I don't know. But it's certainly not going to be of the scale to allow a political leader to stand up and say, you know what, we've taken manufacturing back to where it was.
Yeah, but I find this interesting. Well, two things. Is it not possible to have both, the best of both worlds, expanding mining and expanding manufacturing?
Yes, it is. But then it's got to squeeze something out, right?
What, we just don't have the workforce?
Well, I mean, whatever workforce you've got at any point in time, if you want manufacturing to be a larger share of the economy, and you also want to hang on to mining, it's got to come from somewhere. And where's it going to come from?
And the other thing is the national security argument here that we hear from the government. We've got to do this. We've got to have more, control our supply chain for various reasons. China being the one they won't mention, but that's the one we all know. What do you think of that?
If that's what we're really worried about, we wouldn't be talking about manufacturing photovoltaic cells. Well, we might be, but we'd have a much bigger discussion about the need to manufacture aeroplanes and cars and, washing machines and refrigerators and all those things that, well, we didn't manufacture aeroplanes, but, those things that we used to manufacture. And those things are more vital to our way of life than photovoltaic cells, even though, obviously, we do need to install more photovoltaic cells in Australia in order to meet the net zero challenge. But unless you believe that we cannot rely on those global supply chains to provide us with what we need, and look, there's no doubt there's risk, right? But unless we believe that those things are so risky, there is so much risk there that we have to do it in Australia, the case for manufacturing those things is not strong, because the photovoltaic cell manufacture appears to benefit from economies of scale. That is, the more you produce, the lower the average cost of production, and anything that benefits from economies of scale and is tradable. The world price is going to be below Australia's average cost of production. That's just simple arithmetic, right? And so in order to make it work in Australia, in order to make it profitable to do the activity in Australia, there has to be a government subsidy that bridges the gap between the world price and the Australian average cost of production. And that's a subsidy that has to be permanent, and somebody has to pay for it. Right. Yeah. I mean, what people forget is that the people who are going to have to pay for these subsidies are the same young workers who are going to have to bring the budget at some stage back into surplus.
Which brings me to your concerns about young workers and how they're being squeezed. You have been warning about the damage to the social compact in Australia as a result of all of this. What is your big concern, and what needs to change immediately?
Yeah. The tax system does need to change. And it's getting very close to immediately. Look, the intergenerational contract that we have, or social compact, whatever language you use, it relies upon a pretty straightforward proposition that the present generation is able to state with some degree of confidence that the living standards of the next generation of Australians will be even better than what we enjoy. I cannot state that with confidence. I don't think any of our political leaders can state that with confidence. And when I talk to young people, as I know our political leaders do, and I know they hear the same thing, when I talk to young people, what they say to me is, you know what, all this great wealth that you talk about that Australia has, it's not my wealth, it's your wealth. How do I get my hands on this wealth? I can't buy a house. Housing's unaffordable. In fact, many are now saying, I can't even find a suitable house to rent, far less buy. I'm looking at older people like you who are living on tax-free superannuation. I'm still paying off this HEX debt. I can see that my nominal income is going up, but it's not going up as fast as inflation. My real wages are falling. Because my nominal income is going up, I'm suffering bracket creep. So my average rate of tax is going up on a declining real income. You know, it's pretty hard to explain to young people that, well, hang in there, this is all good. And when they dig into the tax system, what they see is a tax system that favours investment in speculative capital gains over investment in things that will produce increases in productivity, in real business investment that will drive increases in productivity. And if we don't see those increases in productivity coming through, then we're going to consign the present generation, the younger generation, to lower living standards. It's just the only sustainable source of real wages growth is increases in productivity, and our productivity performance has been absolutely lousy. And the principal explanation for that has been that over many, many years now, business investment in Australia, as a proportion of gross domestic product, has been at levels that we only ever saw previously in the deep recession of the early 1990s. So that's quite an extraordinary thing.
And to tackle that problem of business investment, productivity, the disincentives there for younger workers as well. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of things, and this gets back to the Henry Tax Review recommendations as well.
Yeah.
But right now, what would be the few things you would say really are no-brainers that need to be fixed?
I wouldn't. I'm sorry, David. It's not that easy.
Right.
But I think there's a real problem in thinking that we can do this bit by bit. I mean, yeah. I've heard the Treasurer say that he's doing tax reform in bite-sized chunks, and I say to myself, oh, he needs to develop a bigger appetite, or a bigger mouth or something. Like we've got to do a lot of stuff, and
it needs to be holistic.
It needs to be holistic. Well, I mean, you can do a few big things, and all that does is, or you can propose a few big things, and all that does in our adversarial political system is draw attention to those few big things, right? And they become hotly contested in an election, and guess what? They don't happen. Or if they do happen, they get overturned as soon as there is a change of government. So, no, that is not the way to go. Having said that, in general terms, what we need to do is we need to place less reliance on labour income generated by young workers. That is the only thing, and it's actually bracket creep in that area, that is the only thing that's acting to lift the tax revenue to GDP ratio. That is to restore some measure of fiscal responsibility to the budget. It is the only thing. Fiscal drag in the personal income tax system. The company income tax system, this is a strange device in Australia, because what we use the company income tax system to do is to tax part of the what economists call the normal return on capital, but part also of these big windfall gains that the miners and there are supernormal profits made in other sectors of the economy because of a lack of sufficient competition and so on. And so the company income tax is also applying some sort of tax, like a proxy windfall gains tax or something, to those particular sectors of the economy. There's nothing wrong with that bit of it, but the tax on the normal return to capital, we've got to get that lower. We've got to get it lower. Not only do we have to get it lower, we shouldn't stop with companies, right? If you think about how individual Australians invest their savings, the whole plethora of vehicles that are available for Australians to invest their savings on, every one of them's taxed differently. Different tax rates here, there, blah, blah, blah. And everybody knows the owner-occupier home, you want to build wealth, and you've got wealthy parents wealthy enough to stump up a deposit, get a negative for a negatively geared property. That's what you should do. If your parents are wealthy enough to give you a deposit for a home that is going to be your principal place of residence, fantastic, right? I mean, in the last 20 years, average house price in Australia has tripled, right? I mean, God, you just look at those numbers and you think, wow, what a tax system. What a way to accumulate wealth, right? And then there's superannuation, where and I understand the reasons why superannuation is taxed in the way that it is, but what I don't understand is why we have not yet moved to ensure that at least the earnings inside the superannuation fund that are supporting the payment of tax-free pensions to people in retirement. I don't understand why those earnings are still exempt from tax, right? I mean, Cannot get my head around that at all.
It's going to be a brave politician, though, who takes this on, which gets us back to this difficulty of reform these days. But if these things aren't done, just finally, where are we headed? What's the stark reality here?
The stark reality is the banana republic, right? I mean, that's basically the economy. This economy of ours relies upon the rest of the world having confidence in us. We're not able to chart our own course entirely. I mean, we thought before the onset of the global financial crisis that we'd more or less got to a position where we didn't have to worry about what the rest of the world economy thought of us. And then we learned a really hard lesson in the global financial crisis when the rest of the world said, you know what, we're going to deprive you of funding. And that was potentially absolutely catastrophic. But it taught us a lesson that in this economy of ours, you know, which is not, and a lot of our former leaders have said this, and I remember Paul Keating saying it on many occasions, the rest of the world does not owe us a living. We have to find our own future here, but we have to find it in a way that the rest of the world thinks is something that should be applauded. I mean, we have to actually be better than the rest of the world. And for a long time, we were. But over the last 20 years anyway, the rest of the world has been losing interest in us. And we should never allow ourselves to get into that precarious position.
Well, on that warning, let's call it that, Ken Henry, we'll leave it there. Really good to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good to be with you, David.
All right. And don't forget, you can subscribe, rate, review, do all those things, and send us your suggestions for this podcast. The email is insiders@abc.net.au. Any ideas, suggestions you might have. If not, we'll see you Sunday. Bye for now.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.